The rules of war are over. Russia made a massive, unforgivable mistake by launching one of its most horrific attacks against Ukrainian children. Payback was immediate and absolute. Just hours after the attack, we got a report that the United States lifted key restrictions against Ukraine. British and French missiles are now unleashed to strike deep inside Russia, hitting refineries and military factories that Putin cannot defend. But you see, retaliation didn't stop there. US has now enacted back-breaking sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil, two of Russia's biggest oil companies. Russian stock market is melting down and Putin is furious. But he has no one to blame but himself. By targeting Ukrainian children, he forced the West to declare that time for talking is over. It's the moment war became personal. This all started yesterday morning when Putin carried out one of the most horrific attacks of this war. Russian drones flew into a kindergarten at 10:30 a.m. Ukrainian time. This was right in the middle of a school day in the morning. We have footage of the strike and we have footage of the rescue mission that first responders carried out after the strikes. But even then, Russians are denying this all, claiming that this whole kid stuff was a setup by NATO and this was in fact a NATO site. But let me show you the evidence and you decide for yourself. And here we also have the aftermath, where first responders are trying to evacuate all children. We can hear kids calling out for their moms. Now, according to some Russian propagandists, this was Russia's revenge. So you may be asking, revenge for what? Well, let me show you. Earlier that morning, Ukrainian armed forces used British-supplied Storm Shadow to take down a Russian chemical plant in Bryansk. This plant is a crucial facility in Russia's military-industrial complex. It produces gunpowder, explosive, combat charges, rocket fuel, and so on. Russia started this invasion. That means Ukraine was well within their rights to destroy this plant. And in revenge, Russia is targeting kindergarten kids. But according to Russians, kids are all just actors. And this was a NATO facility. But the thing is, one thing Putin forgot was that even though he lost all compassion, the rest of the world still has it. And this is where he kinda missed that First Lady deeply cares about Ukrainian children. It's important to remind everyone watching that just a few months ago, back in July, President Trump publicly admitted that it was the First Lady Melania who convinced him that Putin's promises are not really worth anything. Take a listen.
I go home, I tell the First Lady, and I spoke to Vladimir today. We had a wonderful conversation. She said, oh really? Another city was just hit. So it's like, look.
On top of this, when Putin came to Alaska, First Lady had a personal letter delivered to him, and it had a very specific message. It asked for Putin to protect Ukrainian children. And that's something the Russian army really has not been doing. They've been kidnapping Ukrainian kids and moving them to Russia and just having random families adopt them. Well, I guess what Putin did yesterday was a bit too far. Well, that's because just hours after that strike, we got this bombshell report from Wall Street Journal. United States lifts key restrictions on Ukraine's use of European long-range missiles. The move coincides with a Trump push to pressure Moscow into talks on ending the war. Now, this is where I want to clarify the details because the wording on this report is very specific, and that's for a reason. US is not giving permission to strike inside Russia because Ukraine already has that permission. They've been using drones to already go inside. But The wording says US lifts key restriction. So the question rises, what was that restriction? You see, even though these missiles, they are European made, mainly from UK or from France, they use targeting data that is still supplied by the United States. So, after President Biden, that targeting data was held back, meaning we did not tell Ukraine that they cannot strike inside Russia. What the process was that if Ukraine identifies a target, they would have to request permission from their US counterpart. And then that request goes all the way up to Pete Hegseth, who's Secretary of War, Secretary of Defense. And if he approves it, Ukraine can hit that target using US data. But if he doesn't approve it, Ukraine cannot hit that target. Even though they have the missile, they have UK's permission who made the missile, they don't have the targeting data. That's the big thing that US now doesn't decide on. That privilege, or I guess, I can't remember the right word, but that ability to approve and reject a strike is not with Pete Hegseth anymore, but rather that power now goes to top US general in Europe, and that is General Alexis Greenwich. He's also the NATO commander right now, and in my opinion, it's a lot better that he's the one deciding, because he's a lot more pro-Ukraine than Pete Hegseth. That's not to say Pete Hegseth is anti-Ukraine, but there have been some miscommunication between the administration and Pentagon, and we don't know who's causing that miscommunication. So technically speaking, US is not giving permission to strike inside Russia. All US is doing is providing the targeting data for targets that Ukraine is picking out. And Ukraine is using British-made missiles. Now, this technicality is important because just hours after this report came out, President Trump put out this statement.
Please.
You had a Truth Social post earlier this afternoon talking about a Wall Street Journal report as a fake story.
Yeah,
It
fake.
sort of
Wall Street Journal is fake. Less fake on financial than it is on gossip.
Can you just confirm that my understanding of what's happening is accurate? As I understand it, that story framed it like we had just lifted the U.S. a restriction on intelligence.
No, it said that I gave Ukraine permission to shoot missiles deep into Russia. I didn't do that. Second of all, they're not using our missiles. They're using, I think, European missiles or from someplace, but they're not using ours. And what they do, I don't control that. But I do control our missiles. They're not shooting our missiles in. It was a fake story. Wall Street Journal does a lot of fake stories.
Now, Trump is not the biggest fan of Wall Street Journal, but report doesn't say what he's claiming it says. It never says that, hey, Trump gave permission. It's saying US has lifted the restriction, which is true, because we saw a Storm Shadow strike happening on a Russian facility that we talked about at the start of the video, and that's only possible if US is providing the targeting data. But for me, it's funny that we're now leaning into this talking point where we're basically claiming, hey, it's not the United States that's carrying out this strike. It's the European countries, it's Ukraine, and it's everyone else, but not us. Because I feel like that's kind of what Russia does. It's Russia talking point where you use half-truths to push your side. And now Russia is getting taste of their own medicine. Now, I say that not because of just this statement alone. He also made a similar statement later in the same press conference. Take a listen to this.
And we're not selling any weapons to Ukraine. We're selling them to NATO, which is different from before. With Biden, he just gave $350 billion worth of weapons and cash right into Ukraine, and that was so foolish. But we sell them to NATO, and in theory, you can do what you want with them. It doesn't have to be Ukraine, but probably it is mostly.
No, what nations are doing now is buying.
I mean, come on. We can't say we're not selling weapons to Ukraine. It's just we're selling it to NATO, and we know where it's going, and that's why we're selling it. Because this is how the whole process works. Ukraine submits a request for weapons they want. That request goes to NATO commander, who we just talked about, and then he looks at it, see if US has it, if US has enough of it, and then he approves it. And then NATO buys the weapons and gives it to Ukraine. Pretty clearly, we know why this is happening. We just don't want to admit it. And I'm happy about that. This is how Russia operates. They always use these informational warfare type of narrative to just confuse everyone. And now we're kind of doing the same thing. It's much harder for Russia to blame the United States when the president is publicly saying, we're not giving weapons to Ukraine. We're just giving it to NATO. We are not approving the strikes inside Russia. Only Europe is doing it. I know Europeans may not be happy about it, but for me, it makes me happier thinking that Russia is getting a taste of their own medicine. As I said at the beginning of the video, the retaliation didn't stop there. The biggest news was, of course, the sanctions. And the reason I say this was the biggest news is because we haven't had any new sanctions in this administration. Trump has extended some sanctions that President Biden announced, but those were just extensions. This is brand new and it's definitely one of the hardest sanctions US has ever announced. That includes all the sanctions that were put on under President Biden.
Today is a very big day in terms of what we're doing. Look, these are tremendous sanctions. These are very big. Those are against their two big oil companies. And we hope that they won't be on for long. We hope that the war will be settled. We just answered having to do with the various forms of missiles and everything else that we're looking at, but we don't think that's going to be necessary.
US puts sanctions on Russia's Rosneft and Lukoil companies. These are two of the biggest company Russia owns, and Rosneft is actually state-owned, so that this hurts Putin's bank account a lot more directly. Now, listening to all this, I'm sure that the question everyone's asking is like, isn't Russia already the most sanctioned country in the world? What difference do these sanctions make compared to the older ones? Well, let me explain. First of all, this is not just sanctions on Rosneft, this is any company that these companies own 50% or more of, which hits a lot more subsidiaries and everything else. And on top of that, these sanctions are very different than the older ones. Now, this is something we've talked about in our previous videos, but this was a long time ago. At the end of 2022, I think Western countries announced something called a price cap, which meant Russian refineries, Russian oil producers could sell their oil, but they couldn't sell it for like above a certain price. And the price we announced at the beginning was $60. And a few months ago, a lot of European countries have reduced that price cap to $47. Meaning anyone who's buying Russian oil, they had to make sure they buy it below that price, because if they weren't, they would get hit with sanctions. So this was sanctioned, but it was more so like, hey, you can drive on this road, but you can't drive above a certain speed limit. You could still drive below it, which helped a little bit, but it wasn't as strong as what we're announcing now. Now it's just like, you just can't deal with them at all. You can't drive on this road at all. So any company, any country that does any kind of business with these companies will face their own sanctions. And on top of that, these companies cannot use US dollars at all anymore. So this means the Russian companies will have to just do a lot more maneuvering around to do business, and that does hurt. That means their cost will go up and their margins will go down. So sanctions do work, just not in the way many people talk about it. It's not going to be like the Russian economy is going to be dead tomorrow, because trust me, I want that, but that's not going to be the case. More so what's happening, if I were to put it in an analogy, is like there's a noose around the Russian economy, and every time new sanctions are announced, the noose gets tighter and tighter. So it's not dead, but it's getting harder and harder to breathe. Now, it's not just the fact the US sanctions. US also called on European allies, UK, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada to follow along. They asked everyone to just do the same sanctions. And on top of this, while this is happening the same day, EU passed their 19th sanction package. And that package is unique in a way where they're targeting Shadow Fleet itself. They're targeting 100 or more than 100 vessels that are part of this shadow fleet that Putin has been using to ship his oil to countries like India and China and Turkey. And that also is very effective, because that means anytime we see one of these ships docked at, let's say, a port in China or port in India, that means we can now go after the company that's operating that port, because they're dealing with a ship that's sanctioned. And that creates kind of a disincentive for all these companies to don't have those ships dock on their port, or just put in more to hide it. And that does help when they try to hide it, because their costs go up. That means Russia's margins go down. So there are ways companies can try to avoid sanctions, but they are running a huge risk where they can be cut off from US dollars, US banks. And on top of that, while they're doing it, even if they don't get caught, they're still spending more money, so it's hurting the bank account, the Russian bank account. Now, as you can guess, with the announcement of the sanctions, President Trump also announced that he will not be meeting Putin. And the reason for this is simple. We got details about the call between Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov. And Rubio was basically pissed off after the call. He's like, Russia didn't change at all. Their mind has not changed. They're demanding all the same thing. And it's crazy what they're demanding. They're demanding the land that they haven't been able to capture for the last 10 years. And in return, Russia is saying they will stop attacking. That's what they're saying. So they're saying, hey, if you want us to stop attacking, give us more land, which is not a good trade-off in any sense, especially if you know Russian history. As President Eisenhower once said, Russian promise isn't worth a damn. No one wants to give up land based on a Russian promise that they will not invade. But yeah, definitely a positive day in terms of all the action US took. Definitely a very, very horrific day, scary day for Ukrainian kids. And yeah, that's all the updates we have today. If you enjoy these updates, which feels weird to say after covering the news we just covered, please hit the like and subscribe button down below. We're trying to hit 2 million subscribers before the end of the year.